Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's dirty protest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Terminators specifically. It's the start of our look at the elite slot. Now, I'm breaking it down for a couple of reasons, but the main one is that the elite slot can form a variety of roles throughout a given army, and committing in one direction or another is going to change your overall game plan. So I'm breaking it down between the Terminators, the non-Terminator standard elite units, and the Fetid Virium. So we'll talk about them individually because they do many different things, but let's jump in and talk about the Terminators. Now, rather than talk about them as an individual unit, they are, of course, very, very similar and are effectively two sides of the same coin. So firstly, I wanted to talk about the durability of a Terminator versus something like a Plague Marine. Given that Plague Marines have seen a very significant buff, free upgrades across all of their war gear options, whether you're going for ranged or melee, is going to save you an average of 10 points per model. So on a squad of 5, of course, saving 50 points, that lets you squeeze in another squad of Poxwalkers, another Terminator in a squad, another Death Shroud in a squad, whatever it might be. If you were running multiple squads of Plague Marines already, even on that discount alone, you're going to be able to squeeze in extra units, and that's not to mention that many other units in the Codex got a decrease as well. So Plague Marine heavy lists would probably be saving upwards of 150 to 200 points across the whole army. So of course, you have decisions to make as to what you're going to spend those additional free points on, if nothing else. So just to begin with, I wanted to run the numbers of a Plague Marine versus a Terminator in terms of their durability against various different weapon types. Now, of course, I've only done shooting here, but many melee weapons have a similar profile to the ranged weapons I'm talking about here, and you can infer that the same sort of changes in percentage chance would be very similar in outcome. So, first things first, Plague Marine against a bolter, 2 out of 27 shots would get through, roughly a 7.4% chance. Whereas a Terminator against a bolter, and this is whether or not tactical, because Armour of Contempt would be reducing AP1 anyway, a Terminator is half as likely to get hit, 1 out of 27 shots going through. So not only are they twice as durable as a result of their armour, but they have 50% more health as well, meaning that it would take 27 shots to kill a Plague Marine on average, whereas it would take 3 times that to kill a Terminator. So 3 times the overall durability, if you like. Against a Shuriken Catapult, one thing to consider is that the Shuriken Catapult does additional AP on 6s. Against the typical profile, a Plague Marine would take damage 1 out of 9 shots, whereas for a Terminator, that would be 2 out of 27. So for a Plague Marine on the default profile to take to kill a model would take 18 shots on average. Whereas again, for the Terminator, it would be 27 to deal the 2 damage, plus roughly another 13. So roughly 40 Shuriken Catapult shots to be able to take out a Terminator. And again, that's specifically the Avenger Shuriken Catapult on the Dire Avengers. Now, it is important to note here that if they did hit those 6s, the Plague Marines would be on a 6-up save, so of course that does increment the percentage chance they take damage on those by another 2/3, so that would put them up to roughly 16-17% chance to take damage. Whereas for the Terminators, it improves that only by 50% of where it actually is, so only puts that up to more like 11%. So again, Terminator significantly more durable against a weapon like that. The next weapon, a Reaper autocannon, so hitting at strength 7, has a 6 out of 27 chance to deal damage to a Plague Marine, whereas for the Terminators, it is a 4 out of 27 chance. So 50% less damage taken, or 50% more durability, whichever way you'd want to look at it. Against something like an overcharged heavy plasma incinerator, a very common pick on Redemptor Dreadnoughts, which themselves are a very common pick for Space Marines, 10 out of 27 shots, 37%, will kill a Plague Marine. Because with overcharged, it's going to be dealing 3 damage, and that, even reduced to 2, will still kill a Plague Marine. Whereas against the Terminators, it is only a 22% chance to deal damage. So again, roughly 50% more durability. But again, it will also take a second shot to kill a Terminator. Given the output for those weapons on average is 3 to 4 shots, though it can be more swingy than that, ultimately, they're not necessarily guaranteed to even kill a Terminator, especially if only one shot can get through. 22% chance that it'll actually get through from the point of the shot to dealing the damage, and even if it does, it's going to take 2 of them to kill a Terminator. And then lastly, against a Melter, the percentage chance to harm a Plague Marine is exactly the same. So 10 out of 27, 37% chance to deal damage. But of course, with a Melter, they only have a 2 out of 3 chance to actually outright kill a Marine because they're reducing damage by 1. So a roll of a 1 or 2 is going to leave that Plague Marine alive. Anything above 3 damage, well, 3 damage or above, would kill the Plague Marine outright. Whereas against the Terminator, again, you have the same percentage chance as the Plasma Incinerator, a 6 out of 27 chance, which is roughly 22.2%. But there is only a 50% chance to kill the Terminator with that Melter shot. So what that tells us here first is that Redemptor Dreadnoughts are the bane of Plague Marines for the most part, but ultimately they're not as effective against Terminators. Now, the reason I wanted to cover that information is to highlight that although Death Shroud are the poster boys, they are innately cooler by being the elite bodyguard to the likes of Mortarion himself, but Blight Lords do still have a place. Now, that might just be copium because I own 15 of them myself, but I do think I'm being fair in saying here that the Blight Lords form a very obvious anvil role, in that given the percentage differences here against a squad of Plague Marines, and the fact that your opponent may well be bringing Redemptor Dreadnoughts if they are Space Marines, and certainly will be bringing some heavy firepower, potentially 3 damage firepower, if they can, across whatever army you're facing, and that would likely be effective against your Plague Marines, holding that central objective is going to be that much more secure in the hands of Blight Lord Terminators. Now, you wouldn't necessarily want to commit Death Shroud to doing that, despite their exact, symmetrical durability, because they don't have any ranged presence outside of 12 inches, and even within 12 inches, it is a very limited ranged presence. So the reason to bring the Blight Lords, of course, would be to hold that central objective, perhaps to strike in and hold a more distant objective. Depending on the map you're playing, it may be reasonable enough to hold the central objective with your Plague Marines, your Poxwalkers, and it may be preferable to hold an outfield objective away from the opponent using Blight Lords. But either way round, for me, that is the role that they now fill. Of course, when I bought all of mine, that was in 8th edition, and you could strap a Combi Melter to all 5 in the squad. That is no longer a thing, and certainly makes them worse, even following the reduction to 40 points in this new balanced data slate. But let's jump in and take a look at the profiles here. So, Blight Lord Terminators, and truth be told, this is the same other than 2 statistics for the Death Shroud. So it is a 5-inch movement, 3 up weapon skill and ballistic skill, 4 strength, 5 toughness, 3 wounds each, 3 attacks each with a 4th on the champion, leadership 8 with 9 if the champion's still in the squad, a 2 up save with armor of contempt and a 4 up invuln. So of course, similar, arguably tougher units like the Deathwing Knights. Yes, they have got the effectively Armor of Contempt built in because the Storm Shield gives them +1 to their save, they're getting that at the expense of having the Storm Shield, not innately having Armor of Contempt anymore. Which arguably I think is why they should cost that bit more than Blight Lords. But they're only fractionally more durable as a result of them having permanent transhuman. Against certain weapons, that doesn't actually have an effect. So personally, I like the Blight Lords for where they sit in terms of the toughness to cost breakpoint versus something like a Deathwing Knight. But of course, a Blight Lord against a Deathwing Knight, they would get their transhuman in most cases, so ultimately they are arguably tougher when faced against each other. Every model in the squad will have a Combi Bolter and a Bale Sword to begin with, and you can freely swap the Bale Sword out for a Bubotic Axe. The difference between the two, the Bale Sword hits at Strength 5 with AP -3, the Bubotic Axe hits at Strength 6 with AP -2, so you can swap a Strength for a Toughness. They're both plague weapons and they're both a flat 1 damage. So for the most part, the Bubotic Axe is not necessarily the better pick, but the pick that you would need a reason to leave behind rather than the Bale Sword being the be-all end-all. And that's because the Strength 6 breakpoint is very important against infantry. Even some elite infantry at Toughness 4 would go down to Toughness 3. You'd be wounding them on 2s with the Bubotic Axe, whereas you'd only be wounding them on 3s with the Bale Sword. But of course, the Bale Sword has that additional AP, and it is worth considering for that for certain matchups, if nothing else. Now, we've also got the ability to upgrade melee-wise to the Flail of Corruption, which would hit at Strength 5, AP -2, Damage 2, and of course makes double the hit rolls. So you are going to be pumping out more attacks with that model if you've got them with a Flail of Corruption. Now, for me, if you plan to use your Blight Lords to hold the central objective, you may wish to keep them for the main target of the spell Putrescent Vitality. Now, it certainly has its applications offensively when used with the Death Shroud, so this is a toss-up. However, you could look to take a Flail of Corruption and all Bale Swords with the intention that you're going to buff that Strength by 1 to hit the Strength 6 breakpoint, so that any Toughness 4 models that do decide to charge into the Blight Lords on that objective, you can hit them back on a 2-up to wound. Of course, if they're fighting anything tougher than that, then that breakpoint may not be relevant. So if they did send in, a Toughness 6 enemy or something like that, then of course it would still be an important breakpoint, but not necessarily as important. It may be the case that you choose to just hold that enemy in place rather than try and destroy them and overly commit to that. Again, you may have other units in the army that are going to be more effectively equipped to deal with that threat as opposed to the Blight Lords, because sadly that is about the extent of their melee prowess. The guy with the flail is probably the one that will get the work done. Everybody else, they do have a nice number of attacks, they can push the damage, but they're not going to be pushing an awful lot, being 1 damage weapons each. They can have their ranged weapon upgraded, so of course they have a Combi Bolter by default. 1 in 5 can have a Combi Flamer, 1 in 5 can have a Combi Plasma, 1 in 5 can have a Combi Melter. And you can also replace 1 in 5 with a Blight Launcher or a Reaper Autocannon. I'm not going to go through all the combi profiles because they're synonymous throughout many armies. The Blight Launcher is 24-inch, Assault 2, Strength 6, AP -2, Damage 2, and is a plague weapon. The Reaper Autocannon is 36-inch, Heavy 4, Strength 7, AP -2, Damage 1. As far as it goes, I prefer the Blight Launcher immensely. It does allow you to advance and still fire that. It can act as a prop for the stratagem Sickly Corrosion. Hitting an enemy with a plague weapon, any other weapon that targets them this turn will get reroll 1s to wound. Doesn't count as a plague weapon, but it does get the rerolls in a very similar way. So personally for me, I would probably be more inclined now to run the Blight Lords as 1 Blight Launcher, 1 Flail of Corruption, so that's an additional 10 points on upgrades. The rest of them all axes and combi bolters, so that's coming in at 210 points for 5, or if you double that, 420 YOLO for the 10-man squad. Now, at that position, I think they offer a reasonable range threat in the form of the Blight Launcher. Nothing major, but it can at least proc cyclic erosion so that you can do work with your Blight Haulers or whatever else. Maybe you've got a Contempt to Dread, anything like that. They're not going to have plague weapons, so having something in the midboard to proc your cyclic erosion can be really worthwhile. So I think the Blight Lords fill that niche quite nicely, particularly if you're going for no plague crawlers, because of course they've got big range on their plague weapons. No plague crawlers and no no ranged weapons on your plague marines. Of course, you can take a Blight Launcher on your plague marines if you want to. I would recommend doing that as well for the same reason. It's nice to have a few dotted about. But if you didn't want to, then the Blight Lords, of course, would fill that niche pretty nicely. They have got malicious volleys, so they are always going to double tap those combi bolters, which for me is the reason why I don't think it's worth changing to a combi melter or combi plasma. Obviously, the plasma is an upgrade, but I don't think you ever want to overcharge it and risk killing a Blight Lord. They're just worth too much to you to risk doing that just to potentially kill, an intercessor or something, which is without doubt an inferior model. The combi melter is definitely worth a shout. You may wish to take one of those. Doesn't take away from that model's ability to take an axe, so it doesn't take anything away from them, but it is an extra 5 points to do so. And again, given that you can get free melters in your Plague Marines, you don't necessarily want to spend points on Blight Lords that you don't need to if they are not there to break the back of the enemy in shooting, but instead are simply there just to be a roadblock in the way on the central objective, particularly when you consider, as we've said, a heavy plasma incinerator being overcharged. Only 6 out of 27 will get through to dealing damage, and of those it's going to take 2 shots to kill a Terminator. Very few armies are going to be able to pump out 27 overcharged heavy plasma incinerator shots per turn, and even if they did, they would on average kill 3 Terminators. I think if your opponent is doing that, they've committed pretty much their whole firepower to it. 3 Terminators is a perfectly fine trade for their entire shooting phase, for the most part. On to the Death Shroud. So the Death Shroud profile is very, very similar. 5 movement. They've got a 2-up weapon skill, 3-up ballistic skill, strength 4, toughness 5, 3 wounds, 4 attacks on the Death Shroud Terminators, 5 on the champion, 8 leadership, 9 on the champion. And they've also got the 2-up save, the Armour of Contempt, the 4-up Invuln. They have got Remorseless still. They have got Disgusting Resilience still. They have got Contagion still. And they also Teleport Strike. So why would you take the Death Shroud? Well, the reason is that they are a melee powerhouse. They do have the Plague Spurt Gauntlet, and the second on the champion is now free. So these guys come in at 50 points versus the 40 points of the Blight Lords. So you're paying 20% more. They only come in squads of 3 to 6, so you can't go as wide, but at the additional cost, I'm not sure you'd really want to. So the obvious comparison is that 5 plain Blight Lords cost the price of 4 plain Death Shroud. There aren't many ways to up the points on Death Shroud outside of the Chimes of Contagion. The champion can take that instead of a second free Plague Spurt for add 3-inch contagion range to all contagion abilities that the unit has, up to a maximum of 12. I don't think that's really required. Normally, the Gift of Contagion spell effect, adding 6 inches, would typically be enough to get the enemy model that you're looking to get in range, but not always. Particularly on turn 2, striking in, you would have 3 inches from the default contagion range, another 6 equals 9, but you are 9 and a bit away when you strike in, so 9 isn't good enough. If you've included Chimes, you would have a 12-inch range, and even on turn 2 with Gift of Contagion, targeting the Death Shroud, you would then get the enemy model in range, ready to shoot at them with the Plague Spurts. The Plague Spurts are 12-inch range, pistol D6, auto hits, strength 3, AP 0, damage 1. You can, of course, use Mortorion's Chosen Sons to make that damage too, but I don't really think it's worth it going against one of the other more effective general companies, as opposed to that being very specifically the only real game plan for the stratagem in Mortorion's Chosen Sons. They do also bring to bear their Man Reaper, which is the real weapon that will break the back of the enemy here. Each time an attack's made with a weapon, you select one of the 2 profiles. You can cleave for strength 7, AP -3, damage 2, but you take a -1 to hit. or you can Scythe for strength 5, AP -1, damage 1, and you make double the amount of attacks on that profile. So they're great at chewing through armor, they're great at chewing through hordes if they need to. Of course, you never want your Death Shroud to be blocked up by hordes, but your opponent is going to try and mitigate your hammer units, and the Death Shroud are certainly a hammer unit. They have that painted on their back for the most part. So your opponent is going to try and tie them up with weaker units that are perhaps more expendable. But if you can arrange for that not to be the case and strike in far enough away that your opponent can't tag them up with something chaffy, then of course, more often than not, you're going to be wanting to use that big cleave profile to get that big damage through. The 2-up weapon skill in this case would of course go to a 3-up, but that's still completely acceptable. Do bear in mind they would get reroll 1s by being core near a Lord of the Death Guard, and of course if they're near Mortarion, he can select them for full rerolls, which would be very, very nice on the Death Shroud champions. Further to that, the outright comparison is that it is a flat 2 damage versus a flat 1 damage on all outside of the Flail of Corruption. So you're paying that additional 20% for that cleave damage output on the same weapon skill as the Blight Lords would be. So overall, you're getting 1 additional attack per model and 1 additional damage per attack at the same weapon skill. Which for me is probably the main reason why Death Shroud have been the main Terminators we see from competitive lists and friendly lists, to be fair. But my point here is that even from the unfavourable position that Blight Lords are in, which is that Plague Marines look like way better value per damage and Death Shroud look like more value per damage, the Blight Lords are in that sweet spot of being cheaper and therefore not a waste to just hold an objective than the Death Shroud, but still more expensive than the Plague Marines and may feel like a waste in that regard. But as we've mentioned, in almost every case, they offer a very significant additional durability, often 50 to 100% more, if not more than that, against small arms. And particularly the fact that they have that extra wound means that some of the more dangerous weaponry in the game that will certainly be targeted at your Terminators one way or the other throughout the game, they can handle an extra shot of that in a lot of cases versus a Plague Marine, and may present not only an unfavourable target for your opponent to choose between, perhaps causing them to make a mistake in their game plan, but also they just survive 2 shots. Well, they die to 2 shots, they survive 1, rather than your Plague Marine squad that may be taken out in a single shooting phase. You would likely still have a few Blight Lords holding that objective for you, and you can continue to focus on the rest of your game plan of spreading that contagion up the rest of the board. Either way around, I don't think anybody needed convincing to take Death Shroud Terminators. They're very good in that they strike in, and for an otherwise slow army, you can't turn that down. The fact that it's going to be a 9-inch charge in most cases, if not more, means you're unlikely to get that charge turn 1. It is important to consider you might be better deploying into cover, even if that's a bit further away, because your opponent may still be in the position that they need to come towards you on their turn, as opposed to running away from you. Certain armies will run away from you, but again, you've got to mitigate that in your army choices. Bring some ranged threats as well. It's not going to do you any good just to bring an army full of Death Shroud, unless your opponent is a melee army and has to engage with them on their own terms. But again, in something like a tournament, you cannot rely on that being the case. Of course, if you want to run a pure Death Shroud army, of course do it, but it's not necessarily conducive to winning a typical game. So that's that for the Terminators. As I say, I feel like people are a bit doom and gloom on the Blight Lords now, but I'm still certainly interested in running 5 to 10 to hold that central objective. But I will say, I think since the decrease, down to 50 points now for the Death Shroud, and a free second Plague Spurt on the champion, if you're not taking the chimes, then ultimately you are going to see Death Shroud in there to be the beat stick. I'm certainly looking forward to getting my hands on some, but I've still got some Chaos Knights to build before I buy any more models, so it's going to be a little while till my Death Shroud see the field. But let me know what you think. There are an awful lot of combos we can do with the Death Shroud and the Blight Lords, to be fair. We will come back to those in a Wombo combo video. I know lots of you, or a few of you at least, have shared your list with me. If you want to share your list in the comments, by all means, I'll certainly take a look. I'm not going to give you any hate for it. I just, take a look and see what combos I can see within the list, and I'm sure you're capable of making your own decisions in a game. But either way around, if you want to get involved with a comment to that effect or something else, if you want to leave a like or a sub, all those things really help me out. You know how YouTube works, but I wanted to let you know that it really does mean a lot to me. So thank you so much for that. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Underhive.